This audio podcast is available in several places. On YouTube, iTunes, Google Play, Castbox, Overcast, etc. Or you can just add the RSS feed to your podcast player or download the MP3 audio file from my website. If you're listening to the podcast, for example on iTunes, I would appreciate a rating and a review. And on YouTube, subscribe to my channel and click the notification bell icon. If you enjoy a podcast episode, a like is always welcome, as are any comments or questions you may have, which you can add in the comment section below each episode, for example on YouTube. Thank you.
Cheers. Although, if people don't like, they're going straight down into Davy Jones's locker, so they better click the like button.
Hello and welcome to the Sim Racing Perspectives podcast for Friday, the 11th of October 2019. I'm delighted to be joined by Niels Heusinkveld. I hope I got that correctly, Niels, from Heusinkveld Engineering. Hello, Niels, and thank you very much for joining the show.
Hi, Davy. Glad to be here. And the pronunciation was 8 out of 10. Yeah, not bad at all.
I have to keep practicing. Now, Niels, I think the name, for those of us who are big into sim racing and sim racing hardware, and of course Automobilista, the name Heusinkveld is synonymous with sim racing and sim racing hardware, more specifically, like I said. So Niels, with the format of the show, usually I start with getting to know a little bit more about the person and in relation to sim racing, how they actually got started. So can you tell us, how did you get started in sim racing, video gaming itself, and then we'll talk about the hardware business later on.
Well, I'm 40 years old now, so trying to remember all those things is getting harder every year. But it's does go back a very long time. I remember my dad used to work in Amsterdam, and we didn't live there, but he worked there. So every day there was a traffic jam, so he wanted to work more from home.
Yeah.
And then one day he brought home a PC. It was a 4.7 megahertz XT, one of those. You're talking 1987-ish, I think, when he got it.
Yeah.
So a really long time ago. It had one of those green Hercules phosphor glow in the dark Chernobyl screens.
Yes.
With more smearing than anything you can imagine.
Yeah.
So that's sort of my introduction at home to a computer. My friends had consoles and Commodore 64s, but once we had our own system, I somehow asked my brother, are there any games for this? And I think the first racing game he brought home was the absolute first Test Drive, which is a 1987 game. Of course, Test Drive has gone on for and sort of stopped as well.
That's true. Test Drive Unlimited, indeed. Yeah.
Yeah. So the first Test Drive was really old school, very, very weird, but I liked the idea of playing those games, and that's how it kind of started. And I don't know what triggered it, how the stars aligned that day that made me be into racing. But I always liked the idea of playing racing games more than any other type of game.
Yeah.
So that's where it started, and then it just pretty soon, actually, still on that system. I wanted to have like a steering wheel, but I was like 10 years old and had no skills whatsoever. But I was always trying something. When I was like 12 years old, we went to the sort of high school, and we had like activities there, and you could use like a saw and some wood. So I came up with something that moved the joystick left and right, sort of a steering wheel that I made out of wood. It was totally terrible, and some Technic Lego. And by turning the steering wheel, the joystick would move left and right. And that worked about 5 minutes before it completely came apart. But sort of the hardware, the desire for hardware and playing games was there from quite an early age. So and it just never went away. And luckily, PCs got better. In the early 90s, we had the Microprose Grand Prix, amazing game. My keyboard, I don't know if you played that game. Throttle was A and braking was Z, and the comma and the point keys were steering, and
Yeah.
all the letters
With
on them were
force
faded.
feedback, yeah.
Yeah, so all the letters on the keyboard were faded because we pressed it so hard and so
indeed,
long
yeah.
that you couldn't read the letters anymore. And then slowly, more hardware came into play with Thrustmaster wheel, the T2, that I recently bought again, actually, on the Dutch eBay. I don't know if you perhaps
I,
you saw
I,
a video of
I
the
did. I was going to actually, it's on my notes, is one of the things I wanted to ask you about. Yeah. Go on.
So yeah, I just had a sip of coffee.
Yeah.
Like I said, well, we can do this all night on this very nicely brewed black stuff. Anyway, so yeah, the hardware came into play. It got better, and by that time we were up to Grand Prix 2, which I really should play again because this was quite far ahead of its time. So I thought I was brilliant at playing the games, which, well, is youthful exuberance, I guess.
Yeah.
And then before long, it was 1998, and we got Grand Prix Legends. That's sort of the pivotal major sim. Shall I just ramble on, or?
Yeah, go. Yeah,
All right.
it's fascinating. Go ahead. Yep, yep.
I was subscribed to a magazine. Now, for the young listeners, there was a time in the past when internet wasn't really so much of a thing, and people actually bought gaming magazines to read the latest reviews of games and hardware and stuff like that. And I was subscribed to PC Zone, an English magazine.
I remember
And
it,
they
yeah.
had like a cover CD. Every month you got a CD with demos and stuff.
Exactly, yeah.
And without the internet, you couldn't download anything. So this was your source of new games. And on that CD, I'm quite sure it was Need for Speed 3, I think. There was a demo of that, and also Grand Prix Legends. But by that time, I wasn't so much into the Papyrus stuff because I enjoyed the first IndyCar game.
Mm-hmm.
But IndyCar 2 was sort of more of the same. It looked better, but the physics weren't really that different. I think with Dave Kemmer, the guy behind the physics of iRacing and NASCAR racing and IndyCar racing, the first couple of games he did from '89 up until Grand Prix Legends, I wouldn't say the physics engines were identical, but they were sort of 15 frames per second inferior technology. So I expected Grand Prix Legends to be just like IndyCar 2, but then with old cars that I didn't know anything about and were probably terrible. Yeah. So I tried to install the demo, but it didn't work. It missed like a DLL file, so I couldn't even run it. But the game I was interested in was Need for Speed, and I tried to install that, and it was missing the same DLL file. So it was Need for Speed that drove me to finding that missing DLL file in my Windows folder somewhere. And once I got it, figured, well, since Need for Speed works now, I might just as well give Grand Prix Legends a go.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I vividly remember hooking up the wheel, and the sound was like, I almost get goosebumps now. Just like it wasn't good by today's standards, but I was in the pits revving the engine, and the car rocked on its suspension from revving the engine. And that somehow was wow. And then it was Watkins Glen. And if you haven't played the old Watkins Glen, there's those really quick left-right S's. But in the old days, then it was a very long straight over sort of a blind crest, and then you had to brake for a very long right-hander. Mm-hmm. And I vividly remember pressing the brakes, locking all four tires, and crashing and ending up upside down in a hay bale. And I've never had a bigger smile on my face.
Yeah, exactly.
As that, because you could lock the brakes, and it was immersive, and that was the start of like the really serious sim racing. But it's already 21 years ago.
And what wheel were you using at that time? Do you remember? What unit was it?
That was still the Thrustmaster T2.
Yeah.
So imagine a pretty terrible. Well, for its day it was good, but after a couple of years of use, the potentiometers were worn out. So it had peaked a year or two before attempting to play Grand Prix Legends with it.
Yeah, and there wasn't even force feedback, of course, at that time.
No, definitely, and even the wheel that I had, the Thrustmaster, it used a bungee cord,
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
an elastic cord, and
Yeah.
it was just a poor design. So after about 2 weeks of playing with the wheel, it was sort of permanently stretched, and you didn't feel any sort of resistance until you got like to 45 degrees of steering lock. So
Yeah.
pretty poor, really.
But I guess it kind of it goes back to you make use of what you have at the time. Like you talked about driving with the keyboard and using A and Z keys, and I can remember playing a Formula One style game, and I can't remember what it was called, but I always remember I was like 12 or 13 at the time, and I had a Spectrum PC, and I remember looking at the cover artwork and thinking to myself, why doesn't it look like this? Because it was like
Yeah,
and I even had a black. I had my mum had a black and white TV kicking around, so I didn't even. I don't think I even realized the game was actually in color, but I distinctly remember thinking, why doesn't it look like this? So that's why I think that's why I'm so intrigued now with the technology, because you have force feedback, you have the sound, you have the physics and everything, and it goes back to like driving Watkins, like you said, driving Watkins Glen in the demo of Grand Prix Legends, and then locking the car and turning it over, and you were like, "Whoa, this is cool!" And then that's where the kind of the passion and the desire to do more kind of started from, isn't it?
yeah. I think as well, Grand Prix Legends was, you could probably call it the last like revolution in sim racing. Since then has been evolution,
Yeah,
but
true.
up until then, lots of things were missing with Grand Prix Legends. Well, not at the start, but eventually they added force feedback. It had like a good physics engine for its time,
Yeah,
independent suspension, and a reasonable AI. Online racing against 19 other people if you had like something newly fangled as ADSL or cable. But it was so far ahead of its time, and I think since then it's gotten a lot better.
yeah,
But all the building blocks were almost in place with GPL. And before that, yeah, you had such big leaps going from like Grand Prix One in 1991, the Geoff Crammond Microprose game,
yes,
to Grand Prix Two in 1995. That was a major step. There's telemetry and stuff in there.
yeah.
That's why I wish to find some time to play it again, because it's amazing how you can look at all your traces for suspension and speed and stuff in a game from 1995. It's so you had like big evolutions, revolutions every few years, and that sort of stopped uh, because we had 3D acceleration by that point. It's way better than it was then, of course, but the building blocks were kind of the same.
You could see what they were trying to achieve, and indeed, if you talk to anybody who was gaming back in the day, particularly racing, everybody talks about the Jeff Crammond games. Now, in terms of your background in engineering, I mean, at home in your family, I mean, was your dad or your family were they tinking around with cars and motorcycles, and did you go to university and study mechanical engineering, or where in terms of your physics work, which we'll get onto later, what's your background there, or how did you get started with that?
Well, education-wise, in my family, it's funny that you mentioned is my family like into cars or tinkering
Hmm.
and mechanics. No, not at all. Completely the opposite, actually. We had a very rusty, tiny, like a little box with some spanners, and that was all the tools we had in the home. And my father worked at the bank, so it's a really boring compared to like imagining a dad working on cars or
Yeah.
getting all oily. So there was no engineering at all in our family, really. But I liked Technic Lego, uh, which is especially, I think, in the earlier days in the 90s, quite a fun way to learn about transmissions, and you can make cars and steering and stuff like that, and springs and things like that.
Yeah.
And nowadays, it's sort of more large building blocks, and there's a bit less individual parts in there, I think. But it was very much fun to try and do things with Technic Lego. And my father said, well, if you like Lego, perhaps some engineering type career might be a good idea, because when you have to make a decision on what to do for school, you're
Yes.
like 16 or so, after high school, 17, you don't know anything.
Not at
What do I
all.
want to do? I had no idea really, but
Yeah.
I like Technic Lego, and that's why I went to not to university first, but a sort of a lower degree, which is more hands-on, and I went to do mechanical engineering. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And what year then did you graduate from University of Mechanical Engineering?
So this first mechanical engineering course was from I think 1999 until 2002,
Yeah.
and then I went to university, which is a bachelor level, so it's not a master's or a PhD or anything, but bachelor level only.
Yeah.
And I think I finished there 2005 or something.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm getting my years, I think, a bit mixed up, but seems like it was probably a bit earlier, but 2004 ish.
Yeah. And in terms of the program you did, was there, and I guess it differs. I mean, mechanical engineering is a broad topic, and it's similar across, of course, globally. But in terms of how you studied, was there any program there? Like, did you guys build a car together, or how in depth with kind of hands on did you get?
It was never really my strong point to actually build stuff.
Mm.
I was better at thinking of things, but it was very good to be, especially in this lower before university,
Yes.
because in university it's more you're more expected to think of things
More
and do a
theory.
bit less like yeah. But in the lower grade, you were more expected to go into the workshop and go mill something or turn something or weld something.
Yes.
Which, despite me being terrible at all those things, it was interesting to do that and to have some sort of a view of, okay, I can think of something, but there's also a guy somewhere who has to make it. So if I think of something terribly complicated, the guy who has to make it will be angry with me. So perhaps we can simplify it a little bit. So it was very good to do, despite that was not the most difficult study. It was very educational to see the
Yes.
sort of more hands-on in the field side of mechanical engineering.
Yeah. And of course, it leads directly to what you're doing now. Now, I'm going to slightly step back before I go forward, because you told the story, and recently, Alois and Estonia Roof were on Jay Leno's Garage, and I remember you telling a story, and I don't know, was it from one of your talks at the Sim Racing Expo? You had the fascination on the Nürburgring, featuring the Roof CTR. You had it taped on the VHS, and you watched it over and over again. And then you told a story of your mom taping over it. Was it so?
Yeah, that's a sore point. Yeah, it actually happened. Yes,
Yeah.
it must have been early '90s at that point. Yeah, my mom used to tape Oprah Winfrey of all shows
Yeah.
on tape because she had to go somewhere and then she could look at it later. And of course, this was a time where people actually still used VHS to record television shows,
Exactly. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the quality of VHS was quite terrible, especially if you recorded over and over in long play. It was
Yeah.
quite bad. But I remember the Discovery Channel that they were playing at least some part of the Fascination Roof video. And I saw just this yellow thing drifting, and I sort of rushed to the VCR, didn't care what tape was in. I pressed record,
Yeah. Exactly.
and I
Yeah.
sort of sat there drooling in front of the television. And this is
Yeah.
so hard to understand if you're like 20 years old. You've seen everything. You just log in and you see it. But without the internet, these things were very special. You could never watch something like that or find
Exactly.
something like
No,
that.
you couldn't.
So
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
seeing it on the television, I was sort of, wow, this is amazing. I have to record this.
Yeah.
But it was somewhere halfway through, and at whatever tape was in there at that point. And
Yeah.
I cannot really blame my mother for looking for a tape to record her talk show. And
Not at all, because in a way she
at
did.
some point,
Yeah. She
yeah.
did exactly what you did in a way. She just used the tape that was in there, and of course that has happened to all of us. And funnily enough, speaking of the fascination with Roof on the Nürburgring and the internet, I actually watched it again yesterday in preparation for this discussion, and it was low resolution, of course, but I was watching it, and I was trying to wonder, like, what was it about it that kind of got your interest? The guy was driving kind of aggressively, wasn't he? And the car was kind of oversteering a lot, and he was trying to was almost like he wasn't. Almost like he wasn't trying to control the understeer. He was almost like he was forcing the car to spin out and then kind of reel it back in. Or at least that was my impression.
Yeah, and thinking back, I really don't know what attracted me. I think at that point it was still I was 12 or 13 at most.
Yeah.
Didn't really know that much about racing. Perhaps at that point, just starting to watch some Formula One in the early '90s is sort of I started to watch some of the races, but
Yeah.
not really super into watching racing. But I don't know. I don't want to sort of mystify it, but it's as if I saw something on TV. I think, okay, this guy is deliberately almost losing control, but is
Yes.
actually in perfect control, and this is
Exactly.
amazing, and I want to do that in a
Exactly.
game, or
Yeah.
and to chicken to try that in real life. But
Exactly.
something triggered. This is amazing, and the goosebump type of experience watching that.
Yeah. And it's fascinating actually because fascinating. Pardon the pun, but Alois Ruff was on with Jay Leno, and I linked to the video below in the description for the podcast. And
I've seen it.
oh, you have indeed.
Yeah.
And he told the story of how he the company got started. His father had built a bus in post-war Germany, and he was driving the bus. He was driving a charter tour for the locals, and somebody was driving a Porsche 356, and it crashed, and he repaired it, and they sold it, and it started from there. And it was all kind of a happy accident, So that was I thought that was interesting because I've learned a lot. I've been doing some work for a motorsport promotion company here in Finland, and I've been trying to understand things, and I've learned a lot, and because I didn't know, I wanted to know. And Alois Ruff talked about how, for example, they had the longitudinally mounted intercoolers for twin turbos and stuff, and he was talking about the engineering of it, and it was more interesting now because I kind of understand more of how the car works, and also he said that how the CTR Yellowbird was 5-speed, and they had built their own 5-speed gearbox at the time because the Porsche at the time was actually 4-speed. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. If you see the Fascination video, the gear shift, the throw on the shifter is so old school. It's like a foot worth of throw in the gear lever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So now Heusinkveld is known, of course, for Heusinkveld Engineering, and currently you are selling your Sim pedals, of course, your Simbrick GT, which I guess is a aluminium frame, kind of 80-20 style rig, and then you have your shifters and handbrakes. So tell us the story of the Heusinkveld Engineering. How did the company start, or what was the origin of that?
Well, we can actually go back to that first engineering school I went to, because the last year of that, you sort of had to do a sort of a final project, and they were open to suggestions. So whatever you wanted to do, if they deemed it to be of enough complexity and with something you can learn from it, they would be fine. And since I was playing Grand Prix Legends with my Thrustmaster that was almost broken, I asked them if I could design like a wheel and a pedal set for sim racing.
Okay.
And to my surprise, they agreed. And I kind of went to design something that's, in hindsight, you wonder what I was thinking at the time, but you have to start somewhere. So that was the first wheel and pedal set. Of course, no force feedback, and just borrowing some ideas of the Thrustmaster. So I also had a bungee cord for my steering resistance. Nice sort of better bearings, though it all felt a bit better. And very strange pedals that looked a lot like this is very sort of specialist, but the ECCI is another brand of PC hardware.
Yep.
And way back in the early 90s, they also had sort of a weird boat handle, like throttle handle type pedals, and I kind of copied those a little bit. So at the end, with doing my presentation at the end of the year, I brought my PC, and we actually showed Grand Prix Legends, and I drove a lap with it with the wheel and pedals. as part of the presentation. So in a way, you could probably say that the Heusinkveld Engineering almost started there with the first sort of really functional thing that I designed and built. And you should be very, very, very thankful that none of the quality of that stuff ever got sold, but it had to start somewhere.
And what materials did you use, Niels? What did you build it out of?
The most vital part of that steering wheel was the brick, literally the brick that I used to weigh it down.
Yeah.
Because I had some suction cups on the bottom, but the name suggests, they suck. So that didn't work too well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So there was some aluminium in there, way overly complicated for what it had to do. Sort of a copy of the internals of the Thrustmaster wheel.
Yeah.
With some nylon bearings that I made myself on the turning, the lathe.
Yes, on the lathe. Yep. Yep.
And the pedals were I think we had plasma. We had a plasma cutter, which is really sort of rough. It's not as nice as laser cutting. Plasma cutting is more for like 2 centimeter thick steel and stuff like that. But we made some pedal stuff out of that. And then the enclosure was made out of MDF, sort of wood actually.
Yeah.
Because my local hardware store, they were very kind people, and they were always keen to use their equipment to make me something to spec, to size. So I've had some drawings, and they made the enclosure for it. So a really sort of a weird copy of existing wheels and strange materials that I only used because I had some experience with them, and overly complicated, poorly functioning device. But yeah, it was the first one.
The first kind of set of Heusinkveld pedals, if you will. But at least, I mean, the time it was the time it was, and the technology you had, and of course the equipment and the resources you had. But I guess the idea was there. And in terms of the hardware you're selling now, is everything built by hand in the Netherlands, or is it built locally?
Yeah, we put it all together. So almost everything is built here in the Netherlands. So all the laser cutting, most of the parts we try to use local suppliers.
Yeah.
Just because, when you're growing and sometimes something isn't right, or a batch you get delivered isn't quite right, it's so much easier to just jump in the car and pay them a visit and talk about how it should be different.
Yeah.
So it's, of course, an alternative to trying to outsource as many parts to like Eastern Europe or Asia. But we sort of think, okay, we have a high-end product.
Yes.
It's going to cost more. It's not even necessarily better. I'm not saying that in Eastern Europe, in Asia, they cannot make the most amazing parts. I mean, if you have a smartphone, it's probably made somewhere in China and put together very well. But we like the idea of being literally close to a supplier. So everything, all the parts are almost all of them made in the Netherlands or in Germany.
Yeah.
And we assemble everything. So it's lots of bolts and washers and steel parts that we put together. Yeah.
Yeah. And Alois Roof was talking about having 65 employees in Roof in Germany, and Leno was saying correctly, it's small enough to be intimate. How big then is your company, if you want to tell us? How?
That depends. If you ask yesterday or ask tomorrow, it's probably different. We've seen, for some reason, the sim racing thing that's just a hobby that got out of hand it's a hobby that's getting out of hand for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So in the sim racing market is growing, and we're just trying to keep up. That's pretty much how it's going. And we started. I was just putting the pedals and stuff together in my spare room at home. And the whole point was with Sven, who runs the business with me. Actually, he runs it more, and I design more. He does more of the running. I do more of the ideas.
Yeah.
The idea was, if I put together a couple of pedal sets a week in my spare room, and Sven, if you arrange a website and with a shop and you do the support, who knows? We might be able to take our girlfriends out to dinner once or twice a year, and it'll be fun.
Yeah.
And before we knew it, we had like boxes of parts and pedals in the bedroom and everywhere in the room, in the house where there was a little bit of space left.
Yeah.
So it just sort of grew quite quickly. And I think now in total, we are with about 12 people. Not everybody's full time. And there are about 7 guys on the assembly. And then it's a part-time media guy, part-time support guy. And then there is Sven, who is the sort of the brains and the business direction, and do we grow, who do we hire, that sort of thing, and how do we sell, and how do we do everything like that. And we have Remco Hitman. Perhaps if you're in sim racing and in hardware, he built a replica Tyrrell P34, the 6-wheel, the 6-wheel Formula One car from 1976.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
He built like a cockpit for sim racing out of that. It's quite a popular thing. He works with us as well. So it's friends from sim racing, literally very local people, all from the city of Groningen here in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
We happened to get along and have the same hobby and became friends. And now the 3 of us are sort of the running, the brains of the operation.
Yeah, the core of it. And how did you and Sven get together in the start? Where did you guys meet, or how did it begin?
Well, we studied in the same city here in Groningen, and we both played Grand Prix Legends because Sven was doing like economics and I was doing mechanical engineering, so we weren't in the same building and we would never have met. But Sven also played GPL, and I did tell this story at some point, but it's interesting to repeat.
Yeah.
His mother worked at the university, and this is 1999 or 2000-ish. The only places where you had proper internet, like good internet speeds and upload, was at places like a university.
Yes.
So he snuck into his mom's office and he put the dedicated server for GPL on the system.
Really?
And he instructed his mother to turn it on as he left for home in the evening. So we had a good server to race on. And that's, I think, how it was, of course, since it was literally almost next door, the best server with the lowest ping.
Yes.
And enough upload so he could actually host a 19-car race, which was the limit, I think, of GPL.
Yeah.
So that's how we went racing and sort of found out, oh, this guy is very local. Perhaps we should meet up at some point. And since then we became friends and seeing each other not like weekly, but this is like 20 years ago, and every year we saw each other a couple of times, a sim racing event or a birthday party.
Yeah.
So we stayed in touch. That's how I met Sven and how that started, and we just kept in touch. And it was, I believe, 2012 when I was at home and I was thinking, I was working for Reiza Studios for Game Stocker, as it was called then.
Yes.
Which was a little bit of income, but not a huge amount. And I was also working for another company. There's sort of a this whole podcast will be sort of a permanently getting sidetracked. But there was actually another a company in the Netherlands that made entertainment sort of driven arcadey Formula One simulators. And they put them on the cruise ships. And I think it's 5 years ago now when that Italian Costa Concordia was its name, I think. The big cruise ship that capsized in Italy.
Yeah.
Those ships had on board their full motion 1-to-1 scale Formula One replica simulator arcade game thing.
Yeah.
And they were produced locally here in very near Groningen, Netherlands.
Yeah.
And some guy found out that company existed and told me, hey, Niels, that company exists. And I was doing a little bit of physics and engineering at the time.
Yes.
And I thought, well, let's just shoot them an email and who knows. And I said, well, I'm doing a bit of physics. I don't know what you're doing, but, just wanted to introduce myself.
Yeah.
And it didn't take that long for them to invite me, because this arcade Formula One thing that they had was all good and well, but they were trying to develop a simulator more for police and ambulance and fire department sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And they needed their physics to be more realistic. So they were actually looking for somebody who understood it more or less.
Yeah.
And that was sort of a part-time thing for me. And then Reiza Studios started as well. So at that point, I could quit my sort of non-racing job and focus purely on Reiza Studios and this company in the Netherlands making the cruise ship and police ambulance simulators.
Which later sunk. Yeah,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
came to it, and
Yeah.
as did the company very recently, actually. So that's a bit sad, but
that's a shame. Yeah, yeah.
it's a topic for another lengthy discussion, I think.
Another discussion. And how did
so
you?
at that point,
Go ahead. Go ahead, Neil. Sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, I can talk forever. I'm sure it won't take long for you to regret inviting me because this will never end. I'm sorry if if it comes across like that. It's just,
not at all. Not at all. It's all fascinating. Go on. Yeah.
I'm sort of remembering things as we talk as well.
Yeah,
So it's
that's how it goes. Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
So I had that part-time job with that company and with Reiza Studios, and together it was sort of minimum wage, which I was completely content with because I was doing something I liked.
Yeah, exactly.
But it was both very part-time and I had some time left.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, it's been a while, but somewhere in my backpack is this engineering degree. Why don't I try and perhaps make some pedals, because the ones I had back then were sort of at the end. And I thought, well, perhaps we can do something better. So I just drew something up and started working on that because I had lots of time besides the 2 part-time jobs.
I see what you mean, yeah.
And then on one of those, couple times a year parties where I always met Sven, he saw what I was doing and he said, well, how about we do this a bit for fun, but a little bit more seriously. And that's how it sort of took off. In 2013, we had the first, the Pro pedals and the Ultimate pedals. And I think we made a batch of 20 of each and just opened our web shop and had no idea what was going to happen. And what happened was about, I think, 4 days or 2 days later, we were sold out. And that made us think, well, this was only supposed to be a bit of fun like part-time. But
like a test, so to speak, yeah.
Yeah, this could become something.
Yeah.
And since then, it's just kept on growing.
Yeah. And if somebody told you about the company locally in the Netherlands building the simulator for the Italian ship, how did you then get in contact with Renato and the guys from Reiza? How did that come about?
Renato, of course, was modding for R Factor.
Yeah,
I think his main thing was the GP79, so the old Formula One cars, pretty popular mod at the time. He did the physics there, and I think he remembered me mostly from a complaint I sent him in a personal message at the forum or an email. I might have it somewhere.
Yeah,
because at that time, a lot of what I do, and I think what lots of people do, is sort of driven out of slight frustration. Because if there's no reason to improve something, then why would you try and improve something? So I was a little frustrated because I love the era of cars, like the 70s Formula One, amazing. But always with sims at the time, oversteer was hard to control. And being youthful and not doubting my own skill at all, it must be the physics. That's what I sort of, not thought exactly, but I still thought, well, perhaps these physics are somehow resulting in oversteer being too difficult and snappy, and you cannot really drift. You cannot do the fascination roof video, which sort of got me into liking the idea of doing all those things. And
exactly. Yeah.
You couldn't power slide and you couldn't control it properly, I thought.
Yeah.
Without any sort of knowledge and no real experience or knowledge about vehicle dynamics at all. Just youthful stupidity making me feel like that. And I was a bit frustrated. I wanted to exit the hairpin at Montreal. I wanted to exit it sideways in second gear, and I kept spinning and I couldn't control it. So I think I sent Renato sort of not angry, but a comment like, why is it like that? And shouldn't it be more like this? So that's, I think, our first introduction. And I started modding myself for R Factor, being frustrated and having a desire. I think this was my first thing. I want to power slide out of that hairpin at Montreal in the Formula One car, late 70s.
Yeah.
Be opposite lock, full throttle, with a big grin on my face. That was the very
Yeah.
easy goal I set for myself there,
Yeah.
which went terribly wrong because if you look at the physics files, there are so many numbers. And back then I had very, very little knowledge at all. I still do, but it's a lot more than it was. So I didn't know how tires worked or what a suspension even looked like. And yet here I was editing all the numbers and trying to find the needle in the haystack, which is how modding was and sometimes still is for some people, but that's just not the way you achieve good results.
Yeah.
So I was getting a little frustrated. And then I started to make like physics tools using Excel, because spreadsheet, as you know, is my favorite game. It's not on Steam, but it's called Excel.
Exactly. I believe. You know, there's say like, teachers are born, not made, in a way, or you know, a kind of way. The people who can apply themselves to teaching. I believe people who are good in Excel are born, not made. If you know what I mean. Because I have a little bit of knowledge, but I'm more on the artistic side, so I can only go so far, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I always loved the numbers, and the first time I used Excel properly was back in engineering. This time at university.
Yes.
Because this is another incredible side track where this train is sort of derailing again.
But it's all no, it's all related. Go ahead. Yep.
So we had to design like a mechanism for trucks.
Yes.
They have like this hook arm system where they can sort of it can pivot back and then pick up like a container and drag the container onto the truck. There's an existing system. You might have even seen it. There are various systems that do that.
Yes.
And we had the task of redesigning that in aluminium, because they're all steel. And there was this guy somewhere who thought, well, aluminium is lighter, so it's better, and that means we have more payload available for the stuff that actually goes into the containers and is meant to be transported by the truck. And this mechanism has like hinges and pivot points and forces, and there are like hydraulic actuators on there. And getting like a good picture of the forces in the mechanism is quite important, because that means like what sort of a load are we seeing, how strong do all the parts have to be. And it's quite a puzzle, because you can mount the angles a little differently, the pivot points a little differently, and then all the forces will be different. And calculating all that by hand is very tedious and time consuming. And if you've finished it, then you've only had one case, but there are 1,000 options how you mount it exactly and where you mount it. So I tried to make a spreadsheet that sort of had like the dimensions of all the parts and the hinges, the points in there, and I could just change it on the fly and see my forces in the various components to get a rough idea of what sort of a geometry might work best.
Yes.
And I'm very sure, almost sure, that there were many calculation errors in this spreadsheet. Plus the whole concept of making this system out of aluminium was pretty bad idea, and it didn't work in the end. But it sort of made me think, well, this spreadsheet stuff is not just handy for doing your taxes, but if you put the formulas in, you can change the parameters and you see the outcome without having to calculate everything. It seems so obvious now because that's what a spreadsheet is, but it opened my eyes a little bit to the possibilities. So with that knowledge in 2007-ish, R-Factor was out, and I was a bit frustrated with how the cars drove. I started to think, well, all these numbers in these physics text files, I don't understand them. Why not try to make a spreadsheet tool that simplifies the process? And that's how it really slowly got started. So coming up with certain ways to make tires and edit the properties based on the tire size and give it a bit more grip. The tire was bigger. Slowly but surely, some tools came out of my hands that were very buggy, but the idea was to simplify the process. So you weren't changing a number, you were changing something that you understood, and it spit out whatever number that was, but you weren't really looking at individual numbers anymore.
Yes, you were doing a calculation on the fly, so to speak.
Yeah. And instead of just guessing a number, you first thought of some logic. Perhaps a small tire has a grip of 1 and a big tire has a grip of 2. whatever that logic was, and then I just made a tire of a certain size, and it would look at the formula, and okay, this tire is 1.4, and the rear tire is 1.6, something like that. Like not guessing the number, but coming up with the number from sort of a logical table or a formula, and that made it more consistent. And it also started to output, because a lot of what people do is, I think, driven by laziness. For me, definitely. And it's so easy to make a typo in these very long text files with lots and lots of numbers. If you forget a bracket or a comma, the game will crash and you don't know what just happened. And you're chasing your files, and then you find a missing number or a missing bracket. So with Excel, you can also export text files once you figure that out.
Indeed.
So it would write the entire file for me with no like typos and errors. So when it was crashing, I knew for one thing for sure, it's not because of the missing commas and stuff like that. So that really built up and up and up until it was a system where you could create an entire car just in Excel, export the physics files, and start the sim and drive it.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
So that's how I had that. And then I think we had the Corvette C6 mod for R Factor.
Yeah.
Together with Sim Anouk, who's very good with graphics. He worked with Racer, another sort of open-ish racing game back in the day. Excellent 3D modeler. So he made the model, the 3D model, and I did the physics. That was the first car made partially with spreadsheet tools, and it was received quite well. And I think Renato saw that and my progress there, which went on to the Historics mod with the old touring cars and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Was a part of that as well. And then we had multiple cars from the same spreadsheet. So it wasn't just saving one car, but I could make a whole class of cars. There were like 9 TC76, whatever the group of cars was called, vehicles. And they all came from the same spreadsheet. So I was changing things like the tires and just setting certain rules. Like I said, small tire has this grip, a big tire has that grip. Those sort of rules were in the spreadsheet, and all the cars just looked at the rules, and then the number came back, okay, this is my tire. And that's why a Porsche would have a different tire, because it had different size tires than a Corvette.
Yeah.
And that sort of automated the process, and it made it a lot easier to tune 9 cars together, which were all sort of related, but also unique and different because they all came from the spreadsheet. And I think Renato saw that, and then he thought, well, I'm good at physics too, but if we're going to make a game stock car, Renato was also managing almost everything. So he had a lot of things on his plate already. I guess he felt, despite us having a slight argument about the GP79 mod, that I came along far enough with my tools and stuff that he asked me to be a part of the physics team for Game Stock Car.
Yeah, which became Automobilista. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I guess that was the origin of my original question. Like, did you have a history of like tinkering with cars and motorcycles in your family? Because in my head, I kind of think, well, like I said, I've been learning a lot more recently about crankshafts and camshafts and coilover suspension and V8 and inline 5 and rotary engines, and trying to, asking basically somebody that knows, asking noob questions. And he'd say, well, there's never a stupid question. And then trying to understand it. And then I was trying to think, well, if you come up with a concept for taking those values into Excel and exporting that directly to create a physics file, which is a great idea. Trying to understand, well, this is how suspension behaves, and this is how a tire behaves, and this is how weight distribution behaves. So in terms of, you, like you said, you're kind of making it up as you go along to a degree, but in terms of validating your values, is it just you playing the game and thinking, well, I like how it feels, or do you need then to get an actual race driver for that specific car to test it out? And how do you kind of, you're kind of putting, you have your mechanical engineering background, you have your skills in Excel, and you have the games that you play and the experience that you have. There's you and Renato and so on. How do you then put it together as a finished product, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a very good question. that the answer to that sort of evolved with the years, because like you just said, you learn a little bit about an engine or suspension. It was exactly the same for me, and I'm sure as well for Renato when he did physics.
Yeah.
At first, I was way too afraid to look at the aerodynamics. I just used the simple aerodynamics, just a wing with a force on the front and on the back. But there's also complicated diffuser physics, aerodynamics in the game. But those formulas, I didn't know them, but they all seemed very complicated to me. So I didn't even use complicated aero for the first couple of years. By the time we got to Game Stock Car, it was already in, but in the early years. So it's very sort of step by step, just like you just mentioned, how you slowly start to understand things a bit more.
Yeah.
Aero sort of got in there, and then the tires were getting more. I understood more how they worked in the game, because it was sort of very hard to figure it out, because they didn't give you a lot of information with rFactor, just some very short comments in the files that you sort of have to unravel yourself how it actually worked. And so then bit by bit things got added, and only once most of the puzzle pieces were in place, so I kind of knew reasonably sure how the game actually came up with all the forces and stuff. And I sort of was a bit less incompetent grasping aerodynamics and suspensions. Then you sort of know a little bit about every part of the car, just a little bit, but you know it from the tire to the engine to the drivetrain, the aerodynamics, everything sort of isn't that scary anymore. And then a lot of the time, when you make a racing car for a driver, or in some cases for Automobilista and Game Stock Car, we got some telemetry from the real car.
Of course, yeah.
Because Renato is, of course, very close to the Brazilian series, so I think he just used his charm to talk to some of the Formula 3 drivers, for example, and he got some data from their data logging, which we could open. So I could see at a good track like Interlagos, they brake here, and this is the G-force that they pull.
Okay, yeah,
and
of course, yeah.
That's not in itself a starting point, because you don't put G-forces in your physics file. You put weights and grip and everything. It goes through the suspension and the aero, and at the end you get a grip level. But it helped to fine-tune the grip level and the aero to the point where we could see, for example, we're braking later and still making the corner. And you can see from the real data, they are fighting lockup without, braking as late as we do. So they have less G-force. So perhaps we have to look at aerodynamics or tires. There's always a question what the final few percent is, because there are many incorrect ways to arrive at something that looks quite good when you compare telemetry like that. So there's always a little bit of insecurity and uncertainty when you do those things. But it also helps when you get like the data from the manufacturer. And in the case of Formula 3 cars, they are made by Dallara, pretty well known. I mean, they make everything, every single seater that isn't Formula 4 or Formula 1, I think, is mostly from the Dallara factory.
Yeah.
And when you buy a Formula 3 car, you get a manual with it, which has like the suspension pickup points and the weights and the gear ratios and all sorts of stuff. So that helps, because those become facts. So you enter the numbers like the gear ratio, you get a torque curve for the engine perhaps. The more you know for fact and the more you can take as fact, the easier it becomes, because at some point all you're left with is tires and aerodynamics. And aero at some point you also get some data from the wind tunnel, scale model wind tunnel they use at Dallara, but you can trust that reasonably well. So then your only real tuning point becomes tires, because data for that doesn't exist or isn't always one-to-one relatable with real life. So the more data we had from the telemetry from the real thing and from the manufacturer, the fewer guessing points we had, and the better it was to work with. And a great testimony to the physics engine as well, that when you put the real stuff in, you not only get the output that looks a lot like the telemetry as if it came from the real car, but it also feels which is always subjective to some point, but to a combination of driver and sim racer feels convincing and realistic to them.
Yeah. Because it's a simulation, and basically you don't have the G-forces. Indeed, even with a motion rig, it's limited. But you have the on-screen cues, you have the audio, and you have, of course, the feedback from the wheel, and of course the level of the quality of hardware differs a lot. Is it a fair point to say that you may have learned more about how a car actually works in terms of suspension geometry and weight transition by kind of figuring it out from the simulation point of view, and then getting the telemetry data and then the manual for the car, which had the mathematical values of the limits of what the car can do? So is it a fair question to say that you learned more about the mechanisms of an automobile by starting out with simulation, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's the only way I figured anything out about how cars work. Yeah, because prior to that, going into this with the sort of youthful confidence, I'm gonna fix R factor and I'm gonna make it perfect. I didn't know
Indeed.
anything, and that really came slowly, and
Yeah.
it helps a lot because you cannot. You need sort of a skeptical and sometimes logically thinking brain, but getting data for a car is of course excellent because those are some knowns, and when you're working with
Exactly.
physics and engineering, it's you want as little unknowns as possible, preferably one, then you can solve it. So that helped a lot, and especially things like aerodynamics. At some point perhaps we understood how it worked in the game, but how much downforce does a car have? We can have all these ride height dependent aerodynamics, it's all good and well, but how much downforce do you lose from running it too high or too low?
Yeah.
That becomes the next question. So understanding the formulas is great. You can make anything you want. If you want a car that, like a Formula One car, that needs 8 centimeters of rake to get its maximum downforce, I can do that now with my tools in 4 minutes. But we don't know what the real thing would have. So it's always a fight between having to make assumptions because you never know everything, but you cannot just randomly guess it. You still have to try and make an educated guess. So the more data you have, and over the years I've been fortunate enough to work with Formula 2, Formula 3. Well, I'm still more comfortable calling a GP2, GP3, Formula 3, all the sort of the pretty high-end classes that just not F1. I've seen the data for all those cars, so that gives you a framework of this is sort of the properties of tires and aerodynamics from entry-level single-seaters all the way to pretty high-end GP2 cars. And then knowing those sort of limits, if you then have to make a Formula 4 car or somebody has another single-seater, it's probably somewhere in the region of the data that we have.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be, but at least when you make a guess at that point, you have sort of a framework within where you think your guess is sort of educated instead of just randomly guessing something.
Yeah. Because I was thinking the recent car launched by Studio 397 for R Factor 2, you have the Porsche 911 Cup car, which has less aerodynamic qualities than the GTE 911 or the GT3 911. And I was thinking, like, well, if you have a GT car with less aero and you have to simulate that in a title, and then you have, let's say, a 2010 Formula One car, let's say like the Formula V that's in AMS, and it's a single seater car with wings and so on. Like kind of like it fascinates me. Like, where do you start from? You'll have the aero capabilities of the single seater with the wings, and then you'll have the capabilities of the Cup car, which has no ABS, no traction control, and very little aero. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there as well. Thankfully, over the years, with just, of course, we had Reiza Studios, Game Stocker, Automobilista, but I was also making physics models for R Factor for racing drivers and race teams.
Yeah.
So my first job there was with Arden, the GP2, GP3 team in the UK. Sort of the Red Bull, I think the father of Horner is running the GP2, GP3 team.
Yep.
So they were looking to upgrade their simulator in 2010, and I was still young and cocky, so I said I can help you with that. I did actually, because they came from something that didn't work too well. So luckily I had the enough skill to improve it from what they had. But that was some of the gigs besides Game Stock Car. And
Okay.
it wasn't just single seater teams, but also GT drivers over the years.
Yeah.
And I'm always looking for data online, like tire data and
Yeah.
all. It's not, sometimes you think that online it's all very polarized, so people like Assetto Corsa or hate it, but the developers are actually quite friendly to each other. So I wouldn't say frequently, but every now and then talk to Aris from Assetto Corsa, the
Yes.
physics guy,
Mm-hmm.
and to physics guys from R Factor 2. You know, have you seen anything? Oh, hey, I've got this question. How do I do that? Have you seen any data for that? And special mention should go to Todd Wasson.
Mm-hmm.
I never know how to pronounce it. He did the physics for Virtual RC. Don't know if you saw that. It's like a radio-controlled car simulator.
Yes, I've seen it. Yeah.
It's a few years old now, but
Yeah.
he's really hardcore into physics. So whenever I didn't know how something worked, I had a group of people who I could ask, and sometimes they would have something for me.
Yeah.
So at some point, I got some GT tire data from a guy who now works for Studio 397, actually.
Okay. Interesting.
So you sort of give things to each other, and then you see, oh, this is how GT tires might work. And then at some point, I had a Porsche Cup customer, actually, I think it's 6 or 7 years ago. So then you get some telemetry from a Porsche Cup car at, I don't know which track it was, but then you have telemetry for that. So you know, well, this is the G-force they get.
Yeah.
And you get the car manual, and Porsche is very secretive, so it doesn't include nearly enough data to make a perfect simulation.
Mm.
And I think our Factor 2 team is very good at trying to find the right people in Stuttgart to ask for the data, because I think they got quite a bit of it.
Yes.
But it's
I
very hard
expect
to get data sometimes.
Yeah.
So I had like a single seater database, but also did some GT and touring cars and had some telemetry from a whole bunch of different racing cars and classes. So you get a point cloud sort of data points from touring cars to single seaters, and still missing, but it's sort of an area of performance where you can almost guess the car to be in almost.
Yeah, exactly.
And
Yeah.
that gives you a good starting point.
Yeah.
So that's slowly but surely the data came in, and it's not just the data, but also doing this for, at that point, 5 or 6 years, you become more confident, correctly or rightly or not, but you learn a little bit more about how the physics engine works, and you get a bit more confident. And sometimes you have to take a dive into one direction, hoping it's correct, because you just haven't got enough data for that specific part, or your knowledge is lacking. But there was more and more over the years, more and more data that came in from real drivers and telemetry and manufacturers, and my experience grew, and borrowing a lot of information from fellow physics guys and developers in the gaming scene.
I guess over time, with your experience, like you said, it gives you the ability to be in the position to make an educated guess, shall I say, or more educated guess, or a more exact approximation. And the back to the team you were working for in the UK, were they using the original R Factor? Was that the basis of their simulator? It was.
Yeah, and I think up until just a few years ago, I don't know how it is nowadays, but all the racing teams outside of Formula One or big manufacturer, NASCAR or something like that, or LMP, they were all using R Factor, because it was quite open, and they could mess with it and get it to behave a little bit better. So yeah, that's the go-to simulator. And I haven't really been doing much of that work the last couple of years, so I don't know if they've all migrated to other platforms or not.
I think it's R Factor Pro, actually, they might be using.
Yeah, that might sound like an obvious thing, but R Factor Pro is pro in more ways than what it can do. It's also quite expensive in some way, and I don't really know how expensive it even is at the moment. But back then, and still now, racing is often seen as, oh, there's lots of money going around. But outside of Formula One, there is really no money at all.
That's true.
Teams like the GP2 and Formula 3 teams are just happy to get enough budget from the drivers to run for another year. So they cannot spend 50 grand or even 10 grand or 5 grand a year on the simulator. It all has to be part-time using relatively affordable software. And that's why they stuck with R Factor 1.
Yeah. And it's also that there are so many people that understand it. And I think a fellow Dutchman, it was Rudy van Buren, who won the McLaren World's Fastest Gamer. He's been simulation testing for McLaren, of course, big budgets like you say, and I think they're using R Factor Pro. Now, so I don't forget my questions that I have notes here. The recent content that Reiza did for R Factor 2, and this is a precursor to the Automobilista 2. Were you working with the guys on the content that they did recently for R Factor 2 on any level?
No, I was completely not involved, and it's also something that we put the record straight a while ago, because people were thinking, Niels is the guy who does all the physics for Automobilista.
Yeah.
But like we mentioned, Renato was a physics guy himself, and he knows his way around the parameters as well. So he always did it together. Some cars I haven't even touched at all. They were completely done by Renato, and some cars are 95% done by me. But Renato always did the AI tweaking and then some final grip tweaks and aero tweaks and stuff like that. So it was certainly not just a one-man job.
Yeah.
And it's more I'm quite close to R Factor 2, the guys at Studio 397. I even worked with them on the Grand Tour game, which is
I had Marcel and Rene on the show, and of course 397 Studio 397 is luminous, and indeed they worked on the R Factor, the Grand Tour game. Okay, so you were involved in that project as well.
Yeah, so I'm close with the guys at R Factor 2, but I'm also very principled when it comes to, like I said, making physics tools in Excel and creating cars with the push of a button.
Yeah.
And the direction that sim racing seems to be taking is to add more complexity in the physics. And that sounds great, but the tire model in if you would know the tire model from iRacing, which I don't know, it's not open, but it's extremely complicated. And I think they're at model 7 now. And every time it's sort of one step forward, one step back. It's really complicated.
So I hear.
And with R Factor 2 as well has a very complicated physical tire model. And you just cannot work with that in the way that I think is the optimal way to get results from your sim. So it's really a balancing act, because if you think, well, R Factor 2 has this physical complex tire model that does this, that, and everything, it must be amazing. But the reality is also that you have a game with perhaps 25 cars in there. They all have to drive consistently and nicely. And if it takes you a month to develop one car, that's a lot of time. And if you then make a change to the engine, you change the tire model a little bit. You have to go car by car. You have to go back and recreate all of them, which is why in iRacing they sort of introduce each new tire model sort of on a car-by-car basis.
Starting with Skip Barber, for example, yeah.
Yeah, and then because it's a huge amount of work, I imagine, I don't have contact with them, I don't know that, but I'm imagining it's a lot of work to update all the vehicles to the new tire model, because the tire model is very complicated. And at some point, how complicated it is might work against it. So how complicated do you want your model to be if it means you cannot iterate as much because it takes too long to make a tire, versus a simpler model, which isn't very good for marketing because it's simpler, but you understand it deeply and you can create tires for 100 cars in a week if you have to. At some point, just being able to turn them out and to hand them over to guys like, I don't know, Rudy van Buren or Atze Kerkhoff, like the sim racers, and you get feedback from them. I can implement changes in an afternoon. So we can iterate 20 different cars in a week or two. Whereas with the complexity of R Factor 2's tire model makes it really difficult. I don't know the model exactly, so perhaps if the physics guys from R Factor 2 are for some reason listening to this, it might not even be like that anymore, but it at least used to be really complicated and time consuming, plus very hard to predict what your changes would do. Whereas with the older, simpler model, I will know exactly the direction the change will make, and then it's up to lots of driving and Atze or good drivers having a go and then comparing the telemetry again. But it's far easier to iterate and improve and work towards something. So this complexity that's crept in sim racing over the last sort of generation of sim is something I just disagree with. And my method of making cars doesn't work. So I cannot work with R Factor 2 with that physics sim, which is a big shame because a lot of the stuff is better.
It is, yeah, it is. And it's an interesting topic because Automobilista as a game, I mean, many people will say it's kind of the hidden gem. Like Automobilista, when you drive it, the feeling is great, particularly the force feedback. And then you have the guys from R Factor 2. Now, of course, you have the AMS. Automobilista is based on the original R Factor engine from ISI, and then R Factor 2 came along, and it kind of it was like a slowly sinking ship, and Luminous and Studio 397 took over and gave it a breath of life, and people are still waiting on the new user interface, and it takes them a while to get the cars out, and then because it maybe it takes them longer due to this complex tire model, like we can't comment, we don't know, but it does take them a while, and sometimes people will say, well, I spent $5 in Assetto Corsa and I got 5 cars, and now I've spent $5 in R Factor 2 and I got 1 car, and indeed they recently launched the aforementioned Porsche Cup car, and Billy Strange, who was formerly with Inside Sim Racing, Billy Strange did a review, and he said the car's okay, but he was honest, and Billy knows his stuff. He's kind of felt, well, the car it's nice, but it just doesn't feel right for me, you know. So, and maybe there's an element of truth in what you're saying, and indeed that, you know, things are more complex, and maybe there's an element of the complexity, meaning that the development time is taking longer if you have a physics engine where R Factor 2 is based on DirectX 11, and I believe, you know, they have their own code base, and Sector 3's race room is based on DirectX 9, and they have their system. So it's a very interesting topic that you brought up, given how Automobilista, I don't know, it seems to be an easier model to work with, and the driving experience was so good, whereas R Factor 2 seems to be more complicated, but the results seem to vary a lot from the reviews and stuff, and things I read people different people saying, you know.
Yeah, and it's, I always find it funny and funny, and also very sort of a big compliment that people say that Automobilista has pretty consistent handling from car to car.
It does,
which in my opinion is not true. But of course, having made some of those cars, and that's also why I think so strongly about having the physics models being complex up to a point, that Automobilista and Game Stock Car, it's been an 8 or 9 year run. So the first cars we did, especially me, my knowledge of certain things like aerodynamics and suspensions was way different and probably inferior to my knowledge today.
Yeah.
But we cannot really keep everything up to date as simple as that, because Renato has changed the AI, I've changed the physics, and if I update the physics in a way, then the AI will be messed up. So it's very hard to go back to the old stuff and improve it. Now, we did a reasonable job, thankfully, according to lots of people who enjoy playing and the driving experience in AMS. But
yes,
I feel really frustrated when I see the game now, knowing how much better it would probably be, or at least how much happier I would be with a whole different system of doing the physics. Because I mentioned with the historics mod for R Factor,
yeah,
I created multiple cars from one spreadsheet. And with Automobilista, I had my latest spreadsheet that only did one car in great detail and all that. Is very useful, but only one car. And the downside of that is if you make a single seater using that spreadsheet, it works well, that's fine. And then 5 years later, spreadsheet is better. You make a single seater, the same car, it will be different because knowledge has improved. We added cool stuff to the physics engine. But that old car you made 5 years ago isn't easy to update. And the way I see it now, I really think very strongly about this. And I think it's also the reason why lots of racing games have sort of inconsistent handling from car to car. You hear it from, I think, every sim. People complain sometimes it's the people who just cannot drive certain cars. But there is an element of truth in it, because managing all the cars, look at Project Cars 2, the car list. I just scrolled through it the other day.
I was just going to
amazing.
Mention, yeah.
All those cars are just amazing, but having to make physics for them is really complicated. So what I would do, and that's sort of what my view, if you wish, for the future, which is sadly not for me AMS 2. We'll probably get to that later, but
we will.
Is
yeah.
making a tool. I really strongly believe this, and I hope to prove it at some point, or at least put it to the test. Make one sort of ultra spreadsheet where all the cars in the entire game sit in the one spreadsheet. And if you update your physics engine, you add a turbo model, for example.
Yeah.
You update your spreadsheet to put out the numbers for the turbo and make, like, just like I said with the tires, low grip, high grip based on the tire size. Way more complex than that, of course. But then you assign turbo properties based on some rules and formulas. And then each car will get a turbo. And then you drive those cars and you think, well, perhaps the big turbos are a bit too lazy and the small turbos spool up a bit too quick.
Yeah.
You change your formulas and you press apply, and all the cars will have their own improved new turbo. And that way you can keep on track and on top of all the physics content as it develops and as the sim goes on for years and years.
Yeah.
All the cars will be updated at once, and you don't update them one by one over a long period of time. So that's an area where you need very good physics models, but not necessarily ones that are too complicated to put in a spreadsheet or need a PhD to understand. So there's an optimum point that's somewhere where it might benefit to have the simpler-ish. It's when I say simpler and I show you my spreadsheet, I don't think there are that many people who would say, oh, it's simple.
Of course.
So it's not like simple. It's not arcade simple. It's really complicated.
But a better way, a more efficient way of working, shall we say?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's always the case. I noticed it there's news on racedepartment.com and the developer will say, okay, well, we've added a new GT3 car and we've changed this. Sector 3 have added a classic DTM car and we've changed this. Okay, so if you've changed this, does that mean you're going back through all the cars in that class and changing those? Oh yes, we will when we get round to it. And it happens all the time. So it's interesting that you bring up that point. And specifically Project Cars 2. Project Cars 2 was the one title everybody says where it's completely inconsistent. Some cars are great, some cars are not. It's a title I can't really get on with. I don't know why. I find the force feedback system so complex. And now, of course, we have... and now, on a side note, I would love to know how Renato and the guys got on with developing for R Factor 2, but that's another topic for another day. It's interesting now that Renato and the guys are working with this madness engine for Slightly Mad Studios for Automobilista 2. Now, I made some notes on this and I was kind of wondering. Now, obviously, the expectation will be, and there's a lot of, I won't say hype, but there's a lot of anticipation for the title, given the quality of game Stock Car and Automobilista, and indeed the work that you've done on those games, that the quality of Automobilista 2 will be quite high. And I'm wondering, the guys are using Slightly Mad's engine. Obviously it has day and night transitions and weather effects. I mean, R Factor 2 has nighttime and rain, facilitated of course by DirectX 11. Automobilista 2 will of course will have day and night, rain and wind and snow and so on. It'll be interesting to see how that goes. And I'm also interested to see, for example, now I haven't looked it up, but in terms of publishing, will Automobilista 2 end up on consoles? And I hope that it will.
Yeah, I'm not really that involved with them anymore, so those details I don't know. But the inconsistency that you mentioned from Project Cars 2, I haven't played it myself, but I've heard lots of people say that. It's, those games, I haven't been part of the development team at all, but the amount of work you have to do to get a game like that finished with so many cars, it's an immense job. And I think with the task that they had, it was just very hard to, and perhaps they didn't have the tools that I so fondly sort of mentioned I would like to have for myself just a
Yes.
few minutes ago. But it doesn't mean that the potential isn't there, because if you look back to the original R Factor, the first few years, the mods were, there was a Porsche Cup mod with the engine in the front, because that felt better, so we just put the engine in the front instead of the back.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So there is an element of subjectivity always, but it doesn't go as far as, well, it feels better if we make the rear engine car a front engine car. That's of course okay. You're doing something wrong somewhere, or there is an error somewhere. But at the end, R Factor had some great content and great mods. So the physics engine that you use, I'm very convinced, is only at best half of the what you're gonna get. The other half is just knowing it well and understanding it well and putting in the right numbers.
Exactly.
So just the fact that Project Cars 2 has some good cars means that in theory they can all be great. And I know that Renato and the guys are working extremely hard on it, and also found a way to sort of migrate the content to some extent from AMS to their end, to the other engine, the Madness engine.
Yes.
So, which is at some point, I don't know the details, but it also started at least with R Factor type ISI base. Now they've added lots of things and removed lots of things, and then added more things over the years. But somewhere in there, I'm sure there's still some ISI physics code.
I think so. Yes.
So they can achieve. The engine is not going to be the limiting factor, and the fact that there is a game that was slightly, amazing in many ways, and then inconsistent and perhaps frustrating in some other ways.
Yeah.
It's more down to the lack of time and the people who just couldn't get to the point I'm sure they would have all liked
Yes,
at
indeed.
Project Cars 2
Yeah.
Studios, all the cars to be amazing, but
Yes.
the reality of having a publisher and the time constraints just probably didn't allow them to.
And tying themselves to a release date, and maybe trying to be, shall I say, all things to all men, trying to have classic and modern, and basically not getting the time to finish, and then having a publishing schedule, and then DLC also to add. Now, one question I had actually, and I remember I noted things from memory, and it comes back to this is related to your hardware business and game titles. I remember Jimmy Broadbent. I think, if I remember correctly, there was one stage where it must have been 2, 3, 4 years ago. Jimmy's pedal set broke, and I think you guys just up and sent him a set of Heusinkveld pedals, wasn't it so? Which was great, by the way. And I've noticed recently Jimmy was playing WRC8 from Big Ben and Kyloton, and he noted, I think Jimmy added another rig setup in his shed, and he was trying to play WRC8 with his setup. I think his direct drive wheel and his Heusinkveld pedals, and it wasn't working, and so he had to switch to his other rig to get it to work. And it's something I wanted to ask you about. I'm kind of curious, and I had it noted here as a question. In terms of when a new title comes out, and it comes back to sim titles becoming more complicated, and there's so many titles coming out right now. There's Grid is more arcadey, but there's Project Cars and Automobilista and R Factor and Race Room and Dirt Rally. And so when a publisher, a developer is making a game, and you have hardware available that may or may not be supported, do the game developers contact you in terms of creating a profile for your hardware, so your hardware is compatible, or how does the actual process go, if there's such a process in place?
Yes, a very good question, because when you look back at sim racing, this has never been an issue. because all the hardcore sims allow you to have, well, R Factor only allowed you to have 3 USB controllers hooked up.
Yeah.
And in AMS, we upped it to 6. But if you got whatever you have, as long as it works and you can calibrate it in Windows, it'll work in the game. And it's, I think, more sort of a recent-ish development with perhaps the Unreal Engine and other engines and consoles where games are more user-friendly, and this whole setup process, which can be a bit annoying with RFactor 2 and Automobilista, sometimes something doesn't quite work, and do you have to edit a file, or can you find it in the menu? I understand that games are more pick up and play, so they come with presets. But even some of the games don't allow you to manually bind controls anymore, or some weird way that I don't really understand. So I remember we got a mail from the Paris Dakar game guys, and my standard reply is kind of, okay guys, if you're hardcore and you're sim racing, or at least you want at least to sort of have those people play your game, it is impossible to make profiles for all the hardware, because at this point Heusinkveld is no longer small, but we're not the only pedal manufacturer. There are a dozen small pedal manufacturers out there, and handbrake manufacturers and shifters. So you cannot make profiles for all of these. So just allow people to manually bind inputs. Have your presets for the Logitechs and the Thrustmasters and the Fanatecs. Even for us, that's all fine. But allow users to just assign what they have.
Yeah.
That's the message I always send back, and I don't think anybody has ever listened. But that's how the easiest way to do it. And I think we did send some pedals to Codemasters, and we also got email from the WRC8 guys, because they said, well, we wanted to up the simulation value. And I don't really mind sending them a set of pedals, but it's really not that difficult. It's just an axis that goes up and down.
Exactly.
You don't need to have the product there in order to make it work. And just allow people to manually assign it. And at first I thought perhaps it's just the engine constraints. If you use the Unreal Engine, it sort of very much expects profiles or something. But with Card Sim or Cardcraft, what is the one?
Cardcraft,
the new card game.
Yep.
It allows you to assign everything manually, and it works just fine. And that's a one guy or two guy.
It's one
game.
guy, I believe. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Interesting.
So Codemasters is reasonable with it now. I think you can assign it properly. So it cannot be that much work for game developers to just allow manual binding of controls, because there's literally 200 different sim racing peripherals out there, and you can never make a profile for all those 200. Yet they all behave just like a simple joystick, a direct input device. So it's not that hard. So I hope more and more of I don't mind the sort of more casual games coming over and being more user-friendly, but spend a day or two programming in manual control assignments, and then you've got the whole DIY PC market covered.
And your bases are covered, and it's an interesting topic, and that's a good clarification now, and obviously it makes sense that basically if it's a USB input device that Windows can see, let the game see it and bind your controls accordingly. And indeed, if I watch like William Marsh and Jimmy and Sean Cole from the Sim Pit, they're all talking about, well, I have my Fanatec podium, maybe my Leo Bodner bass, or maybe my Fanatec pedals, or my Heusinkveld pedals, and trying to do combinations. And it's the one thing that will annoy them, and it's the one thing that they'll mention, because it kind of it frustrates them. Like you said, they're on PC, they're sim racers, and they want to be able to bind their controls. Now, I remember, I think you told the story of your mum recording over the fascination of Roof with the VHS. You told the story, I think, at a talk you gave at the Sim Racing Expo. So, were you at the Sim Racing Expo this year?
Yeah, we are frequent flyers, you could say.
Yeah.
I think this was the 5th time we were there with stand. So it's a lot of the customers we have are from Germany. Germany is a way bigger sim racing market than the Netherlands.
Yeah.
And it's great to be online, because there are almost no borders, and we get orders from all over the world.
Of course,
thankfully. That's why such a business can exist. If you only ship to the Netherlands, then I would still be working from my spare room and making 2 pedal sets a week or something.
Exactly. Yeah.
So being in Germany and with lots of customers there, we decided to go there.
Yeah.
I'm not personally a big fan of these events. I'm always a stay-at-home guy.
Mm.
But it's good to meet up with existing customers and also have potentially new ones, just trying it out. And there's a lot of people walking around, and for some reason, the internet and stuff and this communication that we do now, you're in Finland somewhere, I'm in the Netherlands. That's something that's very new to human evolution.
Yeah,
It just
indeed.
it's always different when you see people in the flesh. So we sell quite a few pedals to manufacturers of sim rigs, like Fesaro, for example.
Yeah.
And they're at the expo as well, and then you have a chat with the owner. It's just better and different doing it face to face, and it sort of makes you feel like you get a bond and you can trust people meeting them face to face compared to just
Exactly.
sending some
Yeah.
emails. So we're there a bit for the business side and a bit just to
Yeah.
interact with the fans, customers.
And if you do meet the people from the company and you want to call them or email them later, it's easier to do so when you've met face to face. Now, on the topic of sim racing titles maybe becoming more complex and the whole hobby or field of sim racing become more complex, in terms of the Sim Racing Expo in the last 5 years, and maybe the like you have the ultra high end stuff like the Fizarro and virtual reality and motion rigs. You've been attending the last 5 years, like I said. From this year, what's your takeaway from visiting the Sim Racing Expo in terms of how things are changed? How do you think things are in terms of sim racing, or where do you think it's going? And no, it's kind of an open question. Of course, you have hardware, software, esports, and so on. But how do you feel now? You did say that the business, of course, is growing. Your own business, which of course is great. But where do you think the next maybe? I mean, VR and motion rigs. I guess you're only limited by the size of your wallet. But what was your takeaway from the Sim Racing Expo from this year, and how things are going and how things might be in the future?
Yeah, good point. It's always sort of a blur because we are at our stand most of the time, trying to nurse the voice through the days without the voice completely disappearing, and it sort of all goes by in a bit of a blur.
Yeah.
It does seem that each year there is some growth with the exhibitors there, but I don't think it's equal to the growth that we see in the market. It's for us, if you start up as a small company, it's quite expensive to go to an expo like that, because you're not only is it money to be there, but you're also away from doing work that results in money coming in for a few days with a few people. It does become quite expensive, and if we just started out, we wouldn't do it, because we would say, well, this is multiple thousands of euros that we way rather spent in ordering new parts than standing near a bratwurst stand in Germany. So that's, I think, what keeps the smaller places from coming. And for some reason, the Logitechs and Thrustmasters don't seem to. I don't know how, if they've been approached or not, but the more mainstream stuff isn't really there. It's quite high end.
Why not? Why is that, I wonder?
I don't know. I think it's only logical that you represent low end to high end at such an event. But perhaps for us, the event is huge. But if Thrustmaster goes to E3 or something like that, that's a real event, and this might be small for them. But they also see that sim racing is growing. I'm pretty sure they're selling more wheels than they did. So why not have? Yeah. But somehow they are not there, and that's a shame, because all the high end stuff is nice, but it would be nice to have it a more sort of complete thing. But another thing that sort of changed over the last couple of years is just the attendance for the esports racing that they do. Because like 3-4 years ago, there were races, I think mainly with iRacing with Race Room, shown on the huge display at the Nürburgring. There's the biggest LED display. I think it's like 15 meters wide and 10 meters high or something.
Yeah.
All shown there with lots of seats in front of it, and perhaps 25 people were watching. But 2 years ago, there were some pretty good close races there, and it was just packed. All the seats were taken, and people were applauding and going ooh and ah. It was People became more involved watching the esports. I think that because it's more of a thing these days, esports racing and broadcasting racing. Perhaps thanks to guys like Jimmy Broadbent, who when they stream the 24-hour race, you have 5,000 or 8,000 people watching at the end.
Exactly. Yeah. It's kind of
So that's the
fascinating.
part that's growing definitely. But the attendance at the expo is still mainly high end, and I hope it will grow and it will become more mainstream, because there's absolutely nothing wrong and with having a Logitech set, and you can be quicker than 99.9% of the sim races with hardware like that. It's really pretty good, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Of course, yeah.
But you get the idea at the expo that I need 10 grand at least to buy any of the rigs here, which is a bit. I don't know if it's off-putting. People know, of course, that cheaper stuff exists, but it would be nice to have a more broad representation of the sim racing market there.
Yeah, I agree. And from the amount of people passing your stand, how many people know that your company exists or are aware of your products? How many people would say, okay, well, would they be aware that you existed? I guess if it's a high end, if it's a Sim Racing Expo, it's for the sim racing enthusiasts. I guess my question is, would most of the attendants who pass your stand, talking to you and Sven, for example, would they be aware that your products exist? Or were some people maybe, for some people, are you a new company?
Yeah, for most we are. They know us, and we were really surprised to arrive there. And we run Automobilista. We don't pick the easiest car all the time. We have the pedal set fairly firm and the force back fairly hard. So we were thinking, okay, lots of guys will think they're good and they've never played any sim racing title, and we'll have to dig them out of the gravel at turn one. But to our surprise, almost everybody got in and drove quite well.
Oh,
So
interesting.
that's evidence that, yeah, it's pretty relatively hardcore sim races were a big part of the crowd.
Yeah.
And that's the same almost every year. So we don't get that many sort of new guys there. I think it's like it's 2/3 or 3/4 seem to know what they're doing. Whereas if you're just interested in sim racing and you've seen Jimmy Broadbent or Gamer Muscle and you think, hey, this is fun, I should do that, but I've never done this before, we don't seem to have a lot of those people come to the expo.
Oh, and maybe that's the reason why the Thrustmaster and the Logitechs don't have such a presence, because their market isn't there, so to speak.
Yeah, perhaps, but yeah.
Still, it's a
It's
shame.
also, it seems like a huge event when you're there, but of course, it's it for sim racing terms, it is the only expo type event that I know of.
There isn't one
But
in the
it's not.
States anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not like you go to E3 or a car show, Birmingham or whatever.
No.
It's tiny, absolutely tiny compared to any other expo.
Like E3 or Gamescom or Tokyo
Yeah,
Game Show, and then I guess you have a setup in your office where you work, or set up at home, and like, do you actively sim race yourself? What gear do you have? What titles do you play? Do you actively follow motor racing, real world motor racing? What kind of genres do you follow? Or
yeah, interesting. I'm just glancing to my left, and there is a sim rig. It won't be a surprise that it's one of our rigs with ultimate pedals.
Yep.
And the one of two functional H pattern shifters prototypes that are slowly wearing, but still better than the alternatives.
Yeah.
So it's reasonably high end from that regard, but I'm still using my 60 hertz 1080p 27-inch monitors that I bought in 2008 or 9.
Yeah.
So they're really old. I'm contemplating going high refresh rate, but yeah. Currently, I have the first generation sim steering with the biggest motor, so it's the 26 Newton meter one.
Yeah.
But if I twist my neck even further, I see a brand new SimuCube 2 Pro wheel behind me. So I'm going to try that out.
Oh, cool.
Because the first generation of Leo Botnar sim steering wheel especially with the big motor, there is a bit of cogging. You feel the sort of notches a little bit. And it completely goes away if you use the big motor for what it's meant, big forces. Then the cogging is only a small part of the total picture. But if you drive a power assisted road car in a sim, yeah, you feel it's a bit grainy. And the new Sim Steering 2 is way better. So don't think that Sim Steering is coggy, and not at all. But my old system is a little bit, but it's way improved with the new one. But I'm curious how the new SimuCube is. So that's a slight advantage of having a business in sim racing. You can order it on the business and test it out, and it's
exactly. And of course, SimuCube is manufactured by Granite Devices here in Tampere, in Finland. So
yeah, absolutely, yeah,
locally
and
here, yeah.
My first sim steering wheel from Leo Bodnar actually used the Granite servo controller, because the first generation did it. Actually, there are probably 3 generations of sim steering, even though it's only counting up to 2. But the absolute first ones, which I had originally, is using one of the Granite devices servo controllers. Then Leo made his own one, which was kind of funny. I remember the old one, could get if you steered really quickly and you had damping enabled, it could go into some sort of error state by turning too quickly. So if you were drifting and you had like a panic moment, the force feedback would sort of turn itself off because the servo controller saw something that it didn't like. And I remember getting the updated Sim Steering 1, is it, because the previous one was sort of Sim Steering 0 in a way. And when I got the upgrade to the 1.0, I asked Leo, so will I get the error message or the error code when I steer too fast? And he said, there are no error codes. It doesn't know any error codes. So he simplified it a little bit from that side and made it his own servo controller. And it was funny that, what error codes? I don't have that. So
what are you talking about? Yeah. Exactly. And are you using a series of wheels, or do you have a standard circular wheel, or do you have a GT style rim, or what do you use as a rule?
For the longest time, I used a modified or sort of a dismantled G25 steering wheel, actually, which I took off my G25 when it died. So I have my sim steering system. I bought it in 2011. It's quite old. And since, well, you can imagine at that point, I had my wooden MDF rig, and well, I had some money, but most of it went to the sim steering system, which was 3,000 euros back then, I think. So I thought, well, let's just make do with the G25 steering wheel. Then I had a job with Guido van der Garde, Formula One, brief Formula One driver for where did he drive? The green car, the Jaguar. Yeah, sorry, that came from very deep. He wanted to do some sim upgrades, and he was then moving to Sauber. And Sauber made him a 3D printed replica of the actual 2013 or 14 Formula One wheel. And I actually got it from Sauber. So I have a letter somewhere that I kept from Sauber F1. Hi, Niels, here's the steering wheel. And I soldered all the buttons to a Leo Bodnar USB board. And that meant his old wheel, Guido's old wheel, was left over, and I got it. It's an old ARC wheel, ARC. They're Italian. They don't make it anymore. So it has pedal shift and some buttons. That's the main wheel I use for single-seaters, and it's too small for GT cars, but I don't have an alternative, so that's also what I use for GT cars.
So basically, Sauber 3D printed the rim, and they sent it to you, and you actually you assembled the functionality, so to speak, to set up the rig for him. Okay. And do you use the I don't have a direct drive, but you have, like, people say, I think it's something like, it's like 6 or 8 Newton meters is all you really need. Do you run the force feedback, and it's a direct drive? Do you run the forces quite high, or how do you actually like to do it?
It really depends on the car that you're driving. From if you're looking at sim racing as a game and you just want to feel enough detail and be quick and do an endurance race, there's no need for high torque.
No,
But
exactly. Yeah.
it totally depends. Real racing cars that have no power assistance and lots of downforce, the steering can indeed get easily to the level of the 26 Newton meter that this sim steering can do, and I think 25 or 26 for the SimuCube Pro as well. That is no exception, and it is not strange or impossible. It's really, yeah, it's possible, and it will happen. GP2 car, for example, has no power steering, and if you see those guys, they're quite small in length, but they have the muscles. It's really, really tough
Fighting the wheel. Yeah.
yeah. So if for realism, yeah, you do really have to work the steering wheel in certain cars. In IndyCar as well, they have no power steering. Big heavy cars with lots of downforce. It's really physical and really hard work, and that's something when you go from a G25, which I had for quite a few years, my first 4C back wheel,
Yeah.
and then the first second you feel the direct drive wheel, it's way better than the price difference. So it's 10 times more expensive, but it's easily 20 times better.
And the prices of them have come down. I've noticed, of course, and they're still high end, but the prices have changed. Like you talked about spending what $3,000 X number of years ago for the sim steering setup, and it's interesting now because you have you before you would have the direct drive unit and then the box, whereas now it's kind of all in one. SimuCube is an all in one. Fanatec Podium is an all in one. So it really has. The hardware capability really has improved relatively quickly, hasn't it?
Yeah, it certainly has, or at least with direct drive wheels, I don't think I've yet to try it, but I doubt that the SimuCube or the new Fanatec wheel will be that much better than a Sim Steering 2.
No.
But at a third or a half the price, the value is of course way better. So I'm really looking forward to having a go installing the SimuCube and seeing what it can do, because price performance wise, it's they've made such a big step. I have no regrets being an early adopter 8 years ago and paying
Yeah.
everything for it. But it's
Yeah.
great to see that it's the price of a graphics card and a good monitor together. Is you can almost get a direct drive system for it. That's amazing. So the more people that can experience the fidelity, yeah, the better.
I actually, speaking of monitors, I'm on a single 1080p screen as well, and I've noticed something I've been thinking about. I've noticed you mentioned the monitor. It seems to be that these curved screens seem to be a good option now, rather than now those people, of course, many of them also use VR, but these BenQ or Samsung, these 34, 35-inch monitors, those seem to be good from a field of view point of view. I know that Billy Strange has one, and Michi Hoyer from Germany has one, and Gavin Muscle was also recently testing out one. So those look interesting. So I think from a use of space point of view, and if you want to have three screens, I don't have VR, and if you want to have three screens, you need to be able to mount them accordingly. So those wide aspect ratio monitors, 21.9, and some of them are high refresh rate. Those look quite interesting to me.
Yeah, I think that's a good sort of screen to have as well. These days you can even get 32 by 9 screens, I believe.
Yeah.
Just like two monitors side by side. Yeah, like I said, my monitors are very old and 60 hertz. I'm no better with a high frequency, high refresh screen, but at the office we have high refresh ones with a higher resolution and G-Sync.
Yes.
The smoothness is just way better. That's really nice. But with triple screen, the bezels are always there, and it's, despite having used it for almost 10 years, it's not completely intuitive, and it would be better not to have the bezels. And in that sense, having one ultra wide monitor, you sacrifice field of view, but looking to the apex is more natural than with a triple screen if you are a bit confused by the bezels. So I'm not sure what I would do if I would upgrade my rig, go for the ultra wide or go with triple high refresh rate screens. It's hard to say, because there is something to be said for the nearly 180-degree field of view you get with a proper triple screen mount as well.
That is true.
So it's
that's a good point.
And VR has its pros and cons as well. So it's really always a compromise with the display technology. Whether you go VR, triple screen, single screen, nothing is perfect, sadly.
Oh, it's like I always say every setup's like snowflakes. They're individual, and it depends on how much you can spend. And actually, I don't have a direct drive. I have I have a Thrustmaster T300, and that broke. And long story short, basically, it was a warranty replacement. It was only a year old, so Thrustmaster wouldn't fix it for me. So I have a friend who can solder, so I tried to fix it by replacing an opto isolator on the power supply, but that didn't fix it. So I think actually, I think what I need is, what I should have done is taking a voltage meter and checking there's actually power coming into the main board. So that's something I'm working on. And what I did actually, I bought a Thrustmaster TSPC racer from a guy in Scotland via eBay. So it's a long story short. So I still have I must do a video on it someday. It's like a ghetto setup. You know how Carlsberg or Heineken have probably the best beer in the world. I'm going to do like probably the saddest sim rig you've ever seen. But anyway, it it works for me given the setup that I have. And Niels, what games do you like to play? I mean, it's of course time is limited, but what titles do you like to play mostly right now, or what's your favorite to play when you have time?
This may come as a huge shock, but it's typically Automobilista.
Yep.
When you make physics, it can be quite difficult. At least that's how I experience it. To spend too long with cars that you haven't made yourself. It's interesting. Every now and then I try iRacing, and every now and then I hop in Assetto Corsa, and it's always fun initially, and then I get a little frustrated, or I wonder how they did this or how they did that.
Yeah.
And I seem to get the most enjoyment from making a car for Automobilista just as a hobby. So not even the release cars, but just continuously messing with cards, or with the Boxer Cup I recently updated for myself a little bit.
Yeah.
That's what I find the most satisfying when you think of some new idea of how the tires might be slightly better or different. Implement it, try it out. That's really the most satisfying for me. So that's how I spend most of my time. And every now and then I try R-Factor 2 and Assetto Corsa. At the office we had a little competition with Assetto Corsa, with the Formula One, the Ferrari 2015 car that's in there, I think.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
On an insane mountain track that makes absolutely no sense to drive a Formula One car at, but it was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So each game has their pros and cons, but iRacing always frustrates me. I really hope that new tire model is better, but I also doubt that after 10 years, suddenly they do things the way I would like to do it. And I'm not even talking about realism, because at some point I don't know what realism is, and we all strive for the realism with all the sims. I think they all want realism, but there is enough of a subjective element to tires and aero, for example, that even sims that all set out to do the same thing feel quite different. And in my views and, well, almost beliefs, because it's very hard to pinpoint how it actually should be. iRacing has always been too tricky to drive at the limit, and there's always been optimistic about a new version of the tire model, and then I spend money on a car and a track, initially enjoying it, but then I get to the limit and I still find that it's different from how I would do it.
Yeah.
So sooner or later, with most games, I get a bit, I wouldn't say frustrated, that's too negative, but I see the amazing laser scan tracks and the audio I like a lot in iRacing, and of course the online competition is amazing. But if I cannot, like how I started talking about wanting to go sideways, like the Roof Fascination video, if I cannot do that in the cars where you can expect to be doing that, then I get frustrated. I would really like the cars at the limit to be somewhat controllable, and that's where iRacing is sort of losing it, despite all the other positives that it has. R-Factor 2 and Assetto Corsa are way better. So R-Factor 2 is a lot of fun. I tried the GT3 car a couple of years ago, 2 years, 1 year ago.
Yeah.
They had the McLaren. They had this competition, fastest gamer. And I was definitely not the fastest gamer, but I spent a day or two with that, and it was way more intuitive to drive than iRacing, and a lot more fun. And Assetto Corsa as well is a lot more forgiving and drivable. Also weird at times, but being a physics guy, I always sort of hard to enjoy a game because I'm always thinking what's going on behind the scenes that I have no control over. So that makes it a little short-lived usually, the games that I play.
And it's funny, I as somebody who makes videos for YouTube, and I have to admit, not so frequently right now, but every time a new piece of content comes out, it's like, well, okay, well, I want to just sit down and drive. I've come to the point where I just sit down and enjoy it rather than, okay, well, oh, maybe this is interesting, and maybe there's a story here. I make a video. I have to kind of let myself just. That's what I was doing with the. I bought the Nürburgring Nordschleife for R Factor 2 and the Cup car, and I just wanted to say, oh, okay, well, I'm going to go in here, shut the door, turn the lights off, put my headphones on, and just drive and not worry about making a video. Just have fun and enjoy it. And like I said, Billy Strange mentioned, oh, this new Cup car in Nürburgring Nordschleife. It'd be great if the base setup, was better, but you can always set it up as you want. But I don't have a clue, so even if I was to make a change, let's say, I know how to change the tire compound, and I know how to change, for example, the different amounts of fuel. But in terms of and traction control and brake bias and ABS, if applicable, but otherwise I don't really have a clue, and it would be hard enough for me to find the time to spend enough time to kind of notice the differences, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, but sometimes you also shouldn't overestimate the opinion of a fellow sim racer, and
That's true.
and it's very hard to pinpoint. Okay, whose opinion do we trust, and who is right and who isn't? And perhaps one sim racer says, I really love the Porsche Cup car in RF2. Another one says, well, I don't really know. It's a bit weird here and there. Of course, they have test drivers themselves at RF2.
They do.
It's very subjective. Not only making the physics, like I said, is always a subjective layer, but the experience you get playing it is another big subjective layer that you add. So it's really hard to go by reviews or by what people say, because some people just experience it differently based on the hardware that you have. I mean, your setup, it has nothing to do with how much you can enjoy sim racing,
but
the experience
Not
with an entry-level rig, the car just feels different from a higher-end rig with better wheel and pedals. So if
true.
you would change rigs, you would also change opinions on each car you've ever driven, because they feel differently. So it's really hard to go by what people think about cars, and it's hard to tell.
For me, and I tell my kids, it's like driving a car. Driving a car I'll never drive in a place I'll most likely never visit, And I'm just endlessly curious, and the place I've been working at, like I want to know, what's coilover suspension, and what's the difference between inline and V, and like that's it's like you trying to figure out, take the XLs and figure out, okay, well, how do I work out the physics for R Factor? For me, it's like, okay, well, I'm interested in this, and gaming has gone such a point where stuff is kind of photorealistic, if you will, and now there's YouTube and stuff, and I'm constantly trying to figure stuff out, and maybe it's a case of the day you're not figuring stuff out is the day you can kind of give up, if you know what I mean,
Yeah, that's true, and that's at any level. That's that's fine in the sense that everybody enjoys things in a different way, and perhaps the guys who don't worry as much about the car setup or trying to find if it's completely accurate or not, the ones who don't worry about that might be having a better time than those who do.
Probably so.
So
indeed,
yeah.
And it's a case where, for most of the real racing drivers, they will say, well, there's no feeling in the seat of your pants, so most of them will just use it for learning tracks, and it's not the same as driving the real thing. But for, I guess it's, for me, it's an experience I can have at home for X amount of money, and it's also, it's gotten me into motorsport that I wasn't really into before, and and like last night I was looking at the original Le Mans from 1971 with Steve McQueen, and I can watch that now. I watched that now, and I know what the car is, and like when I watch the CTR, rough CTR, the Nürburgring, I know what a 911, and I know I understand so much more. So it's I appreciate it more now that I can watch Steve McQueen and know, well, that's the Porsche 962 or the 908 Longtail and Le Mans and stuff. And so I think for me that's what it's all about. And a final note, I guess I did a tutorial for RFAC for a set of course. It's about an hour long, and I got a comment from somebody saying, "Oh, I just got a Logitech 920 G920, and I just bought a Assetto Corsa, and that's a 6-year-old title. And thank you so much for your tutorial. That gets me started." And for me, that's what it's all about. That's somebody who's getting into sim racing now. They bought a wheel, they got the game. Like, I mean, so many of us now, we bought a Assetto Corsa when it first came out, and we have all the DLC and all the content, and we have the content manager and the shaders patch. And for many of us, Assetto Corsa, it's still active title, but it's not being developed because Kunos and the Kunos have moved on. But it's interesting to see that there's somebody there on the internet, some random person who just getting started, and they're getting enjoyment out of it, and my tutorial that I created helped them, and I guess that's what it's all about for me. It's being part of the community. And it comes back to what you said earlier about, like, if you wanted to find out something about a tire or whatever, you would talk to Renato or somebody from Studio 397 and so on, and knowledge sharing and sharing information and being part of the community. For me, that's the most important thing,
Yeah, and it's great that you do that. And streamers like Jimmy Broadbent, who is like he has exploded with subscribers.
Absolutely.
And with YouTube and tutorial videos, because like we also discussed, some of the sims can be a bit tricky to set up. It's great that there's content out there that makes it easier, and that guys like Jimmy infuse guys who probably never had a wheel to, oh, the sim racing looks interesting.
Yes.
Make it more accessible like that. So it's a great time with all the YouTube and stuff to, compared to when we were young, we had to figure out ourselves because there was nothing out there, no internet to help us. And now whatever question you have or whatever car you want to drive is probably available for Assetto Corsa or Factor 2.
Exactly.
So you could actually watch Le Mans and then get the itch, and you can probably download a Porsche 917 and Le Mans for Assetto Corsa and be driving the car half an hour later. That's just really a really cool thing.
There's even a classic Le Mans pack for Project Cars 2, funnily enough, and of course the content is available for Assetto Corsa. Niels, we've been talking for over 2 hours now, and it's been a fascinating conversation. Yeah. We could go on, but I think we'll have to call it a night. We shall. I want to hear your thoughts on the SimiCube, so we should talk again, or maybe if you get some kind of maybe just a quick video someday of the SimiCube with AMS. I'd be interested to see your thoughts on the gear, because it's always good to get somebody's opinion on the latest stuff,
Yeah, I'm definitely thinking of doing that, because one of the interesting things with Automobilista, the go-karts that I've sort of continuously tweaking, which in other words, making better and then making it worse and then making it better again, and then at the end it's pretty much the same as it was before. That's the true story of physics development, really. But it's very direct, of course, a kart, and at some force level, the old sim steering system and also the new one, it's not weird, but they can oscillate a little bit more than you would like to, like a sort of a vibration. And I'm really curious to see if the SimiCube, which they market like a low latency mode and stuff, if it actually makes a difference. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to comparing them. And I will, if I'm positive about it, I will definitely do a video explaining it and talking about it. Yeah.
I'm sure the guys in Tampere here in Finland will be delighted to hear your feedback. Niels, thank you for joining. It's been a wonderful conversation. I've really had fun having a chat with you, and thank you again for joining. It's been great.
Yeah, likewise. It was really enjoyable, and we did indeed go on for over 2 hours. But I think at some point I warned you this would never end, so at least that was accurate.
You did. You were true to your word. I'll give you that. So Thanks again.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. Bye bye, Davy.
Is that the outro music? Do 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 do.